From 1600 down to about 1750, about 80 years after the Reformation began, around 1600, the Jesuit order of the Catholic Church began what they called reductions. Reductions were little communities that were set up in the South American country called Paraguay. And in those communes or reductions, everybody in the commune was free. They all had liberty. Everybody in the commune was treated the same. They were all equal. And everybody in the commune had a say in how it went, as long as they went along with the Jesuit priest that ran their commune. Okay? So there was liberty, there was equality, and there was democracy. Because in the final analysis, what democracy is, it's mob rule. That's what democracy is. In a talk that I gave last Friday evening, just after Sabbath began, we were talking about Revelation 13, and a woman said to me, well, I'm thankful I live in a democracy. And I said, correction, you don't live in a democracy. Or you shouldn't. America was not founded as a democracy. It was founded as a republic. And those are two very distinct things. A republic is based on inalienable rights, inalienable freedoms that no man can ever take away, where each man is sovereign in his own sphere. That's what a republic is based on. That's why we have the Bill of Rights that were written in the United States. But a democracy is based on liberty, equality, and community, or communism. Okay? Now, that's how the Paraguay reductions were run. But in around 1750, various emperors, Catholic emperors in Europe, got hold of what was going on in Paraguay. Why was that important? Because the Jesuit order was becoming the most wealthy entity in the world. They were becoming so wealthy from these reductions in Paraguay. How? Well, the Guarani Indians on these reductions in Paraguay, they were making clocks, carpets, tallow, soap, beads, jewelry, and all other kinds of goods. And then all of those goods were put on great big ships, taken across to Europe, and all those goods were sold. And the Guarani Indians on these reductions, guess how much money they received for all those things they made? They received this much. Zero. Who got all the wealth from all those goods? The Jesuit order of the Catholic Church. The Catholic emperors in the 1750s got very up in arms. They were scared that the Jesuits were becoming too powerful and too rich. In fact, every Catholic king in Europe at that time had a Jesuit as his confessor. So the Jesuits knew everything about every king, and in so doing, controlled them. When the Catholic emperors realized the power that the Jesuit order was getting, the Catholic emperors began to drive the Jesuits out of their countries. It started in 1759. That, I believe, was in Portugal. Then in 1762, the King of France abolished and drove the Jesuits out of France. In 1767, I believe it was Spain or Austria, drove the Jesuits out of their country. Well, because all of those Catholic countries in Europe had so many colonies around the world, as one Catholic country drove the Jesuits out of their realm, simultaneously all the colonies that those Jesuits were in, they were driven out of there as well. So that within a 10-year period from 1759 to 1769, the Jesuit order was kicked out of 85 different countries. Finally, in 1768, 1769, the Catholic emperors of Europe said, we are going to demand of the Pope, Pope Clement XIII, to abolish the Jesuit order forever. Well, Pope Clement XIII was about to do it in 1769, and as we learned in a previous Behind the Door, the night before he was going to abolish the Jesuit order, he died. He was poisoned to death. And so, for the next 4 years, Pope Clement XIV studied all kinds of documents as it related to the Jesuit order. And he found that many popes down through the ages had thought about suppressing them. Well, finally in 1773, June of 1773, Pope Clement XIV abolished the Jesuit order forever. He wrote a bull to that effect. Well, about 15 months later, after Pope Clement XIV wrote that, Pope Clement XIV died. And Pope Clement XIV died because he liked figs. And a Roman Catholic peasant woman was given some figs by a Jesuit and said, take these in and give them to Pope Clement XIV. They had poison in them. Pope Clement, loving figs, said, oh, great, I love those. He took one, and he began his process of agony that ended up in death. So, by 1773, very interesting year, isn't it? What's going to happen 2-3 years after 1773? The American Revolution. The rise of a Protestant nation in the Western Hemisphere. God had his hand over the 13 colonies. Because if all of these Catholic emperors of Europe had not suppressed the Jesuit order, as American colonies revolted from England, on whose side would all of those Catholic emperors in the Jesuit order, on whose side would they have taken in the American Revolution? They would have taken the side of England, because they would never, ever have allowed a Protestant nation. Well, by 1773, the Jesuit order had been abolished and Europe was in upheaval. In 1775, the Black Pope, the Jesuit general, his name was Lorenzo Ricci, ordered one of his footmen, and the man's name was Adam Weishaupt. Adam Weishaupt was a professor of Catholic canon law at Ingolstadt University, which was a Jesuit school. He was teaching Roman Catholic canon law at Ingolstadt University, a Jesuit college in southern Germany, in a place called Bavaria. Bavaria was a Jesuit stronghold in Germany. The Jesuits controlled Bavaria. And so Adam Weishaupt, in Jesuit-controlled Bavaria, teaching at a Jesuit school, is told by the Black Pope, you are to create a new order that we can use to carry out our dirty deeds in the world. And if anybody has an inkling that somebody's behind it, instead of us getting in trouble for it, you will. The name of the group that Adam Weishaupt created on the orders of the Black Pope, it was called the Illuminati. It was created officially May 1, 1776. Now, in this book called Secret Societies and Subversive Movements by Nesta Webster, on page 197, we see these interesting words, that the Illuminati was built on the principles of the Jesuit order. Page 197, it says, how did these Oriental methods penetrate to the Bavarian professor? According to certain writers, through the Jesuits. The fact that Weishaupt had been brought up by the Jesuit order has provided the enemies of the Jesuits with the argument that they were the secret inspirers of the Illuminati. Nesta Webster does not believe that the Illuminati was Jesuit-inspired. Does not believe that. But folk, I want you to think about the following things, and I've already mentioned them. Would the Jesuits allow Adam Weishaupt to be teaching at one of their colleges if he wasn't a Jesuit? Would they? No. Would Adam Weishaupt be teaching Roman Catholic canon law at that school? And it was through Roman Catholic canon law, when that was created, it was then that the Jesuit order was officially organized. Would he be teaching Roman Catholic canon law if he was not pro-Jesuit order? Would he? No. Would he be allowed to be a professor at a Jesuit school in a Jesuit-controlled area of Bavaria, Germany, if he was not a Jesuit? That's ludicrous, folk. It's ludicrous. I've read countless books. This book, The Illuminati 666, by it's by William Sutton. By William Sutton. William Sutton in this book says, how ridiculous to think that Adam Weishaupt was a part of the Jesuit order. Folk, he couldn't be anything but that. He would never have been allowed to continue teaching at a Jesuit college if he wasn't a Jesuit. That Weishaupt did draw to a certain extent on Jesuit methods of training is recognized even by Burrell, himself a Jesuit. So in creating the Illuminati, according to Nesta Webster on page 197, many of the methods and the order of the Illuminati is right after the example of the Jesuit order. Right after it. And in fact, in a book called Occult Theocracy, and I'm quoting it from the book Vatican Assassins, page 313, it says this. It's actually 213 in Vatican Assassins, 313 on Occult Theocracy. It says, Adam Weishaupt was a brilliant instructor of canon law, the Evil Council of Trent, at a Jesuit college in Bavaria. We read, from the Jesuit college at Ingolstadt is said to have issued the sect known as the Illuminati of Bavaria, founded by Adam Weishaupt. Its nominal founder seems to have played a subordinate, though conspicuous, role in the organization of this sect. Folk, based on history, it's so very, very clear that Adam Weishaupt was used by the Jesuit order to create the order of the Illuminati. He created the Illuminati May 1st, 1776. So now, one of the tentacles of the Jesuit order is the Illuminati. The main principles of the Illuminati, which are also the principles on which the reductions of Paraguay were established, were the principles of liberty, equality, and community democracy. It's very interesting that Weishaupt created the Illuminati May 1st, 1776, and 2 months and 3 days later, on July 4th, 1776, a Protestant nation was established based on republican principles. Freedoms, inalienable rights, civil and religious liberty, a republic. 10 years later, 1787, we have the official writing of the Constitution of the United States. Included in that, the Bill of Rights. 2 years after the writing of the Constitution and the embodiment of the Bill of Rights in the Constitution, we have something called the French Revolution. 1789, the French Revolution began. And folk, I believe an honest look at history will tell us that from the late 1700s down till today has been a titanic struggle between the principles of democracy or communism and the principles of republicanism. We have seen that titanic struggle for the last 200 years. In a book by D. Zahner called The Secret Side of History, Mystery Babylon and the New World Order, page 34, D. Zahner says this: after firmly establishing themselves in Bavaria, the leaders of the Illuminati began to work toward their international goal of overthrowing all existing governments and eventually ruling the world. At that time, 1789, France was the richest and most populous nation on the continent of Europe. And it was here that the great experiment in democracy began. The battle cry was liberty, equality, and fraternity or community. The vehicle was socialism. The French Revolution was a model for socialist revolution, was expressed by the anarchist Prince Kropotkin in 1908. What we learn today from the study of the French Revolution is that it was the source and origin of all the present communist, anarchist, and socialist conceptions. Up till now, modern socialism has added absolutely nothing to the ideas that were circulating among the French people between 1789 and 1794. Do you realize what this person is saying? Do you realize? D. Zahner is saying that the principles that killed millions of Chinese under Mao Zedong, the principles that killed millions of Russians under Lenin, Stalin, Brezhnev, and Khrushchev, the principles that killed millions of people in Africa under people like Idi Amin, or in Southeast Asia under Pol Pot of Cambodia, folk, all communistic governments had their origins in the principles of the Illuminati. And do you know where the Illuminati got their principles from? Nesta Webster said it in Subversive Movements and Secret Societies. The Illuminati got their principles from the Jesuit order. So, folk, the Jesuit order has been responsible for the French Revolution and all the revolutions down through history of modern times. That's who was behind the rise of communism and socialism in our world. The Jesuit order working through Adam Weishaupt and the Illuminati. Now, let me ask you a question. When you think of, and I want an answer, when you think of communism, who do you think of as the founder of communism? Okay, Karl Marx? Okay, David, you said Karl Marx. Faye, you said Stalin. Okay, Stalin was certainly a proponent of that. Now, in the 1800s, a man's name was attached to a document. The document was called the Communist Manifesto. Do you know whose name was attached to the Communist Manifesto? His name was Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a Jew. He was Jewish. You say, why are you mentioning that, Bill? Are you racist or what? Well, folk, it's very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. Down through history, in modern times, the Jesuit order has used various people to do their dirty work. They used the Rothschilds to finance the French Revolution. Do you know what nationality the Rothschilds are? They're Jewish. The Jesuit order, Adam Weishaupt, most books will tell us Adam Weishaupt was born Jewish. Karl Marx, who many people called the father of modern-day communism, Karl Marx was Jewish. Lenin, Stalin, they were all Jewish. Many people who were instrumental in creating the Federal Reserve System in America, Jacob Schiff, Paul Warburg, and now the leader of the Federal Reserve. What is his name? Can somebody tell me? Alan Greenspan. Do you know what nationality Alan Greenspan is? He's Jewish. Do you know what the whole point of that is? The Jews are being set up so that when the time comes and the Jesuits can't hide anymore because all the heat is being turned on them, on the Jesuit order and the Catholic Church, you know what they're going to say? They're going to say, but look who's done all these awful things. Marx was a Jew. The Rothschilds were Jews. Lenin was a Jew. Greenspan is a Jew. And you know where the fury of the world is going to turn, folk? It's going to turn on Jews. That, of course, is after or at somewhere around the same time when it's turned on God's people. Seventh-day Adventists. But you can see that the Jews, the physical, literal Jews, are being set up to be destroyed. And the Jesuits have that planned. Now, I want to read a statement to you from this book called Illuminati 666. It says this, and he's quoting a book called None Dare Call It Conspiracy by Gary Allen. Listen to what this says. Karl Marx was hired by a mysterious group who called themselves the League of the Just Men to write the Communist Manifesto. In actual fact, the Communist Manifesto was in circulation for many years before Karl Marx's name was widely enough recognized to establish his authorship for this revolutionary handbook. You know what that's saying? Karl Marx didn't write the Communist Manifesto. It was written by the League of Just Men. Karl Marx just came along and they had to get him well known enough, and then finally they put his name on it. Listen to what it says here. All Karl Marx really did was update and codify the very same plans and principles set down 70 years earlier by the founder of the Order of the Illuminati in Bavaria, a man by the name of Adam Weishaupt. It's widely acknowledged by serious scholars of this subject that the League of Just Men was simply an extension of the Illuminati, which was forced to go underground after it was exposed by a raid in 1786. What is William Sutton saying there? He's saying the Jesuits used Adam Weishaupt, created the Illuminati, established communistic principles. They were then brought to bear in the French Revolution, and then 60 years later they were all put into a book by a group of men called the League of Just Men. And they, instead of taking credit for it, they put Karl Marx's name on it. And the League of Just Men were Illuminati agents. You know who that means they worked for? They worked for the Jesuit order of the Catholic Church. So the Jesuit order wrote the Communist Manifesto. The Jesuit order is responsible for the communistic regimes of Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev in Russia. The Jesuit order is responsible for the communistic regime of Mao Zedong in Red China. And all other communistic forms of government lay at the door of the Jesuit order of the Catholic Church. And the principles, folk, again, are liberty, equality, and community. Did you folk realize that communism is the purest form of democracy there is? Did you know that? Do you realize when people in America talk about us being a democracy, do you know what that means? When political leaders talk about the fact that we have the greatest democracy, it means that we have in America now the purest form of communism. Let me read a statement to you. This is taken from a book called Dictatorship of the Proletariat. I'm quoting from a little magazine called Chariot Chronicle, July to August 2003. It says, hardly anyone in America realizes that Marxism or communism or Jesuitism sees itself as resting upon the most advanced form of democracy. It must be constantly remembered that Lenin argued that the Soviets, or workers, peasants, soldiers' councils, were a higher form of democracy. But how? We have the Bill of Rights. How could there be a democracy? How could there be communistic principles in America if we have the Bill of Rights? The only way that could happen is if the Constitution was rewritten. Couldn't it? And do you know what? It has been. I want to take you back to probably the most tragic, most difficult, most devastating time in the history of the United States. That was right after the American Civil War. After the war was over, probably America's greatest president was killed. There were 3 million plus slaves who were now free, who didn't know where to go, who had no place really to go, had no jobs. There was upheaval in Washington over how the South was going to be treated after the war was over. Would they be allowed to come back in to join the Union as Abraham Lincoln had proposed? Or would the South be divided up into military districts, and would the people of the South be ruled like they were dictators? Like the South was going to be divided up into districts, and northern generals would rule the South like dictators. What would they do? How would the South be handled after the Civil War? There were many people in Congress that were not pleased with Abraham Lincoln. There were many people in Congress who believed that if Abraham Lincoln was allowed to live, he would be too lenient with the South. You remember when Abraham Lincoln went into office, he was re-elected in 1864, and he said, with anger towards none and with mercy towards all. Abraham Lincoln was going to readily accept the southern states back into the Union. But the radical red Republicans in Congress did not want that to happen. They wanted to force the South to come under their authority and control. The United States Constitution, after the Civil War, was at great risk. From a book called The Tragic Era by Claude Bowers, in the preface of the book, this is what he says. He says, "Never have American public men in responsible positions directing the destiny of the nation been so brutal, hypocritical, and corrupt. The Constitution was treated as a doormat on which politicians and army officers wiped their feet after wading in the muck." The Constitution was in danger after the Civil War. And Claude Bowers, who wrote about a 500-page book on the Civil War, the Reconstruction period, brings that out very clearly. In another document from the London Times, the London Times commented that the Constitution, rather than President Andrew Johnson, is the one in danger. After the Civil War and the death of Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson came to the White House. Folk, do you know what happened to Andrew Johnson during his time in the White House? Do you know what happened to him? Say it? Not assassination. It was worse than that. No, not poison. Something happened to Andrew Johnson that has only happened to one other president in American history. And the man's name was William Jefferson Clinton. Impeached. That's right. Andrew Johnson was impeached, but he was not removed from office, just as Bill Clinton was. The reason that Andrew Johnson was almost kicked out of office was because Andrew Johnson loved the Constitution of the United States. And Andrew Johnson realized after the Civil War that there was a battle going on over the Constitution. Read some statements to you. This is from the book The Tragic Era by Claude Bowers. Page 132. Andrew Johnson said, "It's been my fate for the last 5 years to fight for those who have been opposed to the Union. I intend to fight all opponents of the Constitution." He realized the Constitution was in a struggle. In another speech, he said, "By the eternal God, the Union and Constitution must be preserved." In another statement, this was written by one of his enemies, one of the radical red Republicans in Congress, and he said this, "The President stands squarely against Congress and the people. Neither Jefferson nor Jackson ever asserted with such fearless fidelity and ringing emphasis the fundamental principles of civil liberty." Andrew Johnson was seeking to stand for the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And that's why they tried to impeach him. In another speech, this is on page 241 of the same book, Johnson said he would rather be a free citizen than be inaugurated president over the ruins of the Constitution, and rather be a free man than be president and be a slave. You hear what he's saying? Andrew Johnson was saying, I'd rather be a slave and live under the Constitution than to see the Constitution destroyed and be president. That was the issue, folk, after the Civil War. The Constitution was at risk, and in a little while I'll show you exactly why. Page 160, Andrew Johnson said, he spoke feelingly of his youth. This is Bowers quoting. He says, his devotion to the Constitution and the Union. Let us repair the breaches made by the war and restore the Union. In another case on page 36 of the same book, Andrew Johnson was defending Roman Catholics. And this was Johnson's, what he said. He said, the Catholics had the right secured to them by the Constitution of worshiping the God of their fathers in the manner dictated by their consciences. This country is not prepared to establish an inquisition to try and punish men for their religious beliefs. So Andrew Johnson was standing up and defending the Constitution of the United States of America. Why? Because the radical Red Republicans, which was a group of Republican congressmen, both in Congress, in the House of Representatives, and in the Senate, they were trying to destroy the American Constitution. And after the Civil War, they did. I want to read a statement to you. This is taken from a book called Our Secret Constitution, written by George Fletcher. He wrote it in 2001. George Fletcher is a constitutional scholar. He teaches at Columbia University, and he's a professor of jurisprudence at Columbia University. Listen to what he said. The Civil War called forth a new constitutional order. At the heart of this postbellum legal order lay the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, ratified in the years 1865 to 1870. The principles of this new legal regime are so radically different from our original Constitution drafted in 1787 that they deserve to be recognized as a second American Constitution. The new Constitution established, in fact, a second American Republic. The first Constitution was based on the principles of peoplehood as a voluntary association, individual freedom, and Republican elitism. The second premises of the second Constitution were, in contrast, organic nationhood, equality of all persons, and popular democracy. These are principles radically opposed to each other. Now, what is Fletcher saying? He's saying this. The American Constitution and the Bill of Rights was established on this: civil and religious liberty and a republic, American Republic. The second Constitution that was set up through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments was established on totally different principles. Those principles were liberty, equality, and community. Where did those principles come from that the radical Red Republicans brought to America after the Civil War? Where did they come from? liberty, equality, and community. Where did those American statesmen get those ideas? They were totally opposite of the principles in the original Constitution. Where did they come from? They came from the principles that were set up at the French Revolution. And who set up those principles during the French Revolution? The Jesuit order of the Catholic Church. Folk, right after the Civil War, by 1870, from 1870 till now, the principles of democracy, the principles of communism have superseded and taken over in this country. That is why today, if somebody loves the Constitution, they're looked down on. That's why. That's why there's so many attacks on the Constitution today. Because the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments destroyed the original Constitution that was written by our founding fathers in 1787. The man who was behind it, the key leader in it all, was a man by the name of Thaddeus Stevens. He was a House of Representatives. He was in Congress, the House of Representatives from the state of Pennsylvania. Thaddeus Stevens, and I'll read you just one thing here about him. It says this: he could not compromise. That was at once his strength and weakness. It made him a leader while he lived and a failure in the perspective of years. He held no counsel, heeded no advice, hearkened to no warning, and with an iron will pushed forward his instinct, defying, if need be, the opinion of his time and turning it by sheer force to his purpose. A striking figure on the canvas of history, stern, arrogant, intense, with a threatening light in his eye and something between a sneer and a Voltairean smile upon his hard lips. Such was the greatest party and congressional leader of his time. Now, Thaddeus Stevens ran Congress. He ran Congress. And by the force of his iron will and the fact that most of Congress of his day was controlled by the Rothschilds and the Jesuit order, they went right along with whatever Stevens said. And Thaddeus Stevens was instrumental in the passing of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which changed the American Constitution forever. Who was behind Thaddeus Stevens? It's fascinating. Fascinating material. I'll read it to you, 78 and 79 of the book The Tragic Era by Claude Bowers. It says, whatever his views upon religion may have been, Thaddeus Stevens kept them to himself. He was tolerant of all religions. He attended no church. For the Baptists, he had a certain sentimental regard due to the fact that it was the church of his mother. But then it says this: one of his best friends was a Catholic priest in Lancaster, with whom he liked to talk and walk. And he was tenderly fond of children and extremely sensitive to the appeals of the poor, to whom he was unvaryingly generous. Now, folk, we may pass by that one little comment in that book, The Tragic Era, and say, well, that's no big deal. But for a man who had few friends and a man who was not religious, for one of his best friends who he loved to walk and talk with, to be a Roman Catholic priest speaks volumes in light of what Stevens did in Congress. Thaddeus Stevens was influenced and he was guided by this Catholic priest of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And as they walked and talked on the streets of Lancaster, Thaddeus Stevens was told by that Catholic priest exactly what he was supposed to do in the United States Congress, to completely rewrite the United States Congress from a Protestant document into a Roman Catholic document, which it is today. When it was rewritten, 1865 to 1870, right after the Civil War. The other person that had tremendous influence on Thaddeus Stevens was his housekeeper. The woman's name was Lydia Smith. Lydia Smith was a Roman Catholic. Lydia Smith lived on Stevens's property. Stevens had a large piece of property, and on the back of his property in a nice little home lived Lydia Smith, her 2 children, and her husband, who was a barber. A barber. He cut hair. Lydia Smith took care of Thaddeus Stevens' house. She was his housekeeper. She was also Roman Catholic. Once Lydia Smith's husband died, Lydia Smith moved into the house of Thaddeus Stevens. She never left there again. She would accompany him to Washington whenever he went. I'll read just a few statements here. It says, she was neat and comely. In times as he grew feeble, she became indispensable. When he was in the Capitol in Washington, he entertained his friends. It was Lydia Smith who always met them at the door and prepared and served them lunch. The assumption that she was Stevens' mistress was not confined to undertone gossip. It was current in the press, and in no instance was the publisher rebuked or threatened with a libel suit. The housekeeper lived... Okay, let's see. It's clear from that statement, Lydia Smith was Thaddeus Stevens' mistress. That's who she was. She lived in his home. Many people called her Mrs. Stevens. When people would accuse them of living in an adulterous relationship or living in fornication, and it was put in the local newspapers of the day, Thaddeus Stevens never denied it. When Thaddeus Stevens was about to die, Thaddeus Stevens called 2 Roman Catholic nuns to come to his bedside, and we read on page 222 of the Tragic Era, it says, Sister Loretta, one of the Catholic nuns that came to his room, asked permission to baptize Thaddeus Stevens into the Catholic faith. Lydia Smith was kneeling at the foot of his bed. The 2 sisters were on their knees reading the prayers for the dying. And thus Thaddeus Stevens passed to eternity. At the moment his hand was in that of Sister Loretta, his breast heaved, he pressed her hand, and thus the end came. A year before, he had said that when he was sick, he would rather send 100 miles to have Sister Loretta with him at the end than most ministers he knew. Now, folk, how many people on their deathbed are baptized into the Catholic faith, who all their life lived outside of the Catholic Church? Do you know who gets baptized into the Catholic faith on their deathbed? It's those who have done loyal and worthy deeds on behalf of the Catholic Church during their life. And that happened to Thaddeus Stevens. It's clear from history, Thaddeus Stevens was the man that was used by the Roman Catholic Church and the Jesuit order to rewrite the United States Constitution, so that now in America, the principles that America goes on are not the principles of Protestantism, but we live under a communistic style of government. Page 331, Vatican Assassins, we read this: "We are at a loss for words in describing the dismal, diabolical, and demoralizing depravity of Thaddeus Stevens, this singular man. While living with his Roman Catholic concubine during his dictatorship in Congress, he was the great tool of the Jesuits in creating their socialist communist monster of the 20th century, 14th Amendment America. Stevens was called a traitor by President Johnson while he destroyed the government of the old Union, changed its form and spirit, and made a new Union with new theories and new powers." Horace Greeley, one of Stevens's masters, added, "We have brought all laborers to a common level by reducing the whole working population, white and black, to a condition of serfdom." On his deathbed, this old communist was baptized into the Roman Catholic institution for a job well done in obedience to the papal Caesar's tyrannical Holy Alliance and the Black Pope's evil Council of Trent. We no longer live in Protestant America. We live in 14th century Roman Catholic America. And it's been going on like that for the last 130 years. Slowly but surely, through Supreme Court cases, slowly but surely through events in America, through tragedy and terror and trial, Americans are slowly but surely being brought to the point where every shred, every dot, every bit of ink on that original Constitution will be forever